On a clear morning in 2013, 6 diving students watched their instructor vanish into water that was only 85 feet deep. In the investigation that followed, experts would struggle to explain how an experienced diver with over 3,000 logged dives could simply disappear from a well-mapped reef, or why his last recorded words through the radio were about something impossible lurking in the depths that knew his name. But what haunted the investigators most wasn't Jake Livingston's disappearance. It was what happened to everyone else who heard the audio from his final dive. The strange events began 2 weeks earlier, during what should have been a routine safety briefing at Jake's diving school off the coast of Okinawa. Jake had been going through standard procedures with a new group of tourists when one of his students, Naomi Satoshi, found an old diving magazine in the shop's waiting area. Inside was a detailed article about a massive creature spotted in the ocean. The article included a grainy photograph and a witness description that would later prove significant. Naomi, fascinated by marine life, read the article thoroughly before her first lesson. What happened during Naomi's initial dive should have been Jake's first warning. 20 feet underwater, practicing basic breathing exercises, Naomi suddenly began thrashing in the water, her breathing rapid and irregular. Through her panic, she kept pointing at something in the deep blue beyond the reef wall, but Jake saw nothing there. He helped her surface immediately, attributing her behavior to common first-time diving anxiety. But Naomi's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She refused to go near the water, not even the shop's rinse tanks. Jake found her one morning staring into a puddle in the parking lot, trembling, insisting she could see something massive moving beneath the surface. Her claims became more specific about its size, its features, the way it moved through impossible spaces. Several other students who heard her descriptions began showing similar signs of anxiety around water. The morning of the incident started normally. Jake was leading an advanced certification course with 6 students, including 2 who had been present during Naomi's episodes. The dive site was a well-known reef wall dropping to about 100 feet, with excellent visibility and calm conditions. The group's plan was to practice deep diving techniques. At 85 feet, one of the students who had heard Naomi's description suddenly pointed toward the drop-off, his body language showing clear distress. Jake checked his gauges, confirmed normal readings, and swam closer to investigate. His helmet camera was recording, standard procedure for all certification dives. The footage recovered later showed nothing unusual in that direction, just the typical blue void beyond the reef wall. But the audio picked up something that investigators still cannot explain. Beneath the regular sounds of bubbles and breathing, there was a low-frequency vibration that grew progressively louder. What happened next was captured by multiple sources: the helmet camera, the students' GoPros, and the boat's sonar. Jake swam about 10 feet past the reef wall to demonstrate there was nothing to fear. The moment he passed that threshold, his body jerked violently, as if pulled by an invisible current. The sonar showed no unusual water movement. The next 40 seconds of footage have been analyzed by dozens of experts. Jake's camera showed him suddenly surrounded by open ocean. No reef, no bottom visible below, and no surface light above. His depth gauge, visible in frame, suddenly read 847 feet. Physically impossible given their location and his equipment. Through his radio, still functioning despite the impossible depth, Jake's breathing became rapid but controlled, his years of experience evident even in crisis. He reported his position calmly to the boat above, describing how the water around him had changed. The students and boat crew confirmed they could hear him clearly, though their responses grew increasingly panicked as his descriptions continued. The camera footage showed brief glimpses of something moving in the darkness below, something that broke all sense of scale. When Jake turned his head to track the movement, the camera caught a partial view that caused 3 review experts to immediately destroy their copies of the footage. In the final moments of transmission, Jake's voice remained surprisingly steady as he reported a series of observations. The water temperature had dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit. His compass was spinning randomly, and his depth gauge now read 1,247 feet. Then he said something that caused the investigators to permanently classify portions of the audio.
It's the same one from Naomi's magazine, but that's not possible. Those photos were from 1963, but it knows who I...
The transmission cut off. The camera continued recording for another 3 minutes. The audio captured a massive displacement of water, then silence. When the footage resumed clarity, it showed an empty ocean in all directions. The search operation lasted 3 weeks. They found Jake's backup regulator floating 5 miles offshore, but it showed no signs of damage or malfunction. The boat's sonar logs from that day were corrupted, except for one image taken moments before Jake vanished. It showed an empty void in the water column below his position, a perfectly spherical space nearly 300 feet in diameter, where the sonar waves simply didn't return. 2 months later, a deep-sea research vessel operating near the coordinates mentioned in Naomi's magazine article recovered a diving helmet matching Jake's equipment. The camera was intact. Most of its footage was corrupted, but the final frame was clear, a reflection in the helmet's faceplate, showing Jake's expression as he looked at something behind the camera. The investigation noted that in 15 years of diving instruction, none of Jake's students or colleagues had ever seen him show fear. The case remains open, but all diving operations in that area have been quietly suspended. Naomi Satoshi checked herself into a mental health facility, unable to go near any body of water. 3 of the students who heard her descriptions have reported similar symptoms. The magazine article that started it all has never been found. The only official statement on the incident cited equipment failure and unfortunate weather conditions. But the diving community noticed something odd. Several experienced instructors who reviewed the case have since given up diving entirely. One of them wrote in his resignation letter, "The ocean is vast. We know so little about what's down there. Sometimes that's for the best." If you enjoy these terrifying deep ocean tales, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. On February 17, 1998, a Foundation recovery team found a Triton 36,000 submersible floating abandoned in the Bay of Bengal. Inside, every surface was covered in frantic handwriting, equations, coordinates, fragments of memories. The logbook contained one particularly disturbing entry. "I can feel my thoughts being digested." What made this discovery especially troubling was that this same submersible, with these same writings, had already been found and documented 3 times in the past 4 months. The story of how this submersible ended up there began 3 months earlier, on a cold November evening in 1997. Dr. Leo Brown sat in his university office, staring at photographs that shouldn't exist. They'd arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Grainy sonar images showing something massive in the Bay of Bengal, along with heavily redacted reports mentioning memory loss among local fishing communities. As a marine biologist specializing in deep-sea creatures, Leo had documented dozens of unknown species, but nothing like this. The scale was impossible. The sonar readings suggested something hundreds of kilometers long. The documents mentioned a specific location, 0.7 kilometers beneath the surface. Leo knew he couldn't reach those depths with standard research equipment. That's when he found references to the Triton 36,000 submersible being transported through Kolkata. 1 bribe and 3 forged documents later, he had arranged to intercept it. Standing at the port of Calcutta that night, Leo ran through his final equipment checks. The submersible systems all read normal, but something about the vessel felt wrong. The interior smelled like old metal and something else, a scent he couldn't place but somehow recognized. When he opened the logbook to record his pre-dive checks, his hand froze. The book was already filled with entries in his handwriting. October 15, 1997. Depth 700 meters. Systems normal. Strange readings on sonar. October 29, 1997. Depth unknown. Keep forgetting why I'm here. There's something about the water. Gray stuff floating everywhere. Date unclear. I can see it. I can see it. I can see it. I can see... Leo checked the dates again. Some were from weeks ago, when the submersible was supposedly still in transit. Others were dated in the future. He told himself they must be forgeries, though he couldn't explain why anyone would bother. The signature pressure and depth calculations in the margins matched his own unique shorthand perfectly. At 2:47 a.m., the submersible slipped beneath the surface. The descent was smooth until about 400 meters, when Leo noticed his headache. It had started so gradually he couldn't remember when it began. He checked the oxygen levels, normal. Pressure readings, normal. But something felt wrong. His hands looked strange on the controls, like they belonged to someone else. The logbook seemed to be calling to him. He opened it to a new page. November 12, 1997, 3:12 a.m. Depth, 472 meters. Need to document everything. Starting to forget things. Why does the logbook already have my writing? Why do I remember writing those entries but also know I couldn't have written them? The headache intensified as the submersible passed 600 meters. The water outside had taken on a strange gray tinge, like smoke suspended in the darkness. Leo checked his depth gauge, but the numbers kept rearranging themselves. Each time he blinked, they showed different readings. He found himself writing in the logbook again, though he didn't remember picking up the pen. Depth, unknown. Time, unknown. The gray stuff isn't in the water. The water itself is gray. No, my eyes are gray. Everything is gray. I think the gray is thinking about me. The sonar pinged. Something massive ahead. The reading made no sense. It suggested a continuous shape extending for kilometers. Leo switched on the external lights, and that's when he saw it. A wall of flesh undulating in the murky water. It was covered in a film of dark gray substance that seemed to drift off its surface in tendrils. As he watched, the tendrils began forming patterns that looked almost like writing. His head felt like it was splitting open. The logbook was in his hands again. The gray remembers everything. It remembers me from before, from next time, from every time. I can taste other people's memories dissolving in my mouth. The massive shape began to move. What Leo had thought was a wall slowly curved, revealing itself as part of something much larger. A section of it passed by the submersible's viewport, smooth gray-coated skin that seemed to go on forever. He found himself writing coordinates he didn't recognize, mathematical equations he'd never learned, and names of people he'd never met but somehow knew intimately. Then the creature began to turn. Leo found himself staring at an eye larger than his submersible. The pupil contracted slightly, focusing on him. In that moment, his mind shattered. He was simultaneously experiencing every descent he'd ever made to this depth. Dozens of them, hundreds, all slightly different, but all ending here, with this eye. He could remember stealing the submersible tomorrow. He could remember dying here last week. He could remember being digested by the gray substance years ago. His memories feeding the creature's endless hunger. The logbook entries began overlapping each other, different versions of himself writing simultaneously. I understand now. The gray substance isn't being secreted by the creature. It's what's left of everyone. It's digested. Every memory, every thought, every identity, broken down into a gray paste that thinks for itself. The thing about dying is you remember it differently each time. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes it takes years. Sometimes you just keep living, but you're not you anymore. I can feel my thoughts being digested. They taste like metal and history, and everyone else who's ever been here. Found another version of the logbook hidden under the seat. All the entries are identical to this one. Even this entry about finding another logbook, it goes on forever. The gray substance had gotten inside the submersible somehow, though the hull was intact. It coated the walls in thin streaks that formed and reformed into fragments of other people's memories. Fishing boats lost decades ago, research vessels that would disappear next year, ancient creatures that had never existed except in the spaces between thoughts. Leo watched his own memories dissolving into the gray. He could see himself as a child, looking into his first fish tank. He could see himself next week, planning another expedition. He could see himself right now, in 1,000 identical submersibles, all reaching this same moment from different directions in time. The eye was still watching. It had always been watching. It would always be watching. Leo understood now. This wasn't just a creature. It was a place where memories went to die and be reborn as something else. His thoughts weren't his own anymore because they never had been. They belonged to the gray, to the endless flesh that waited in the deep to digest not bodies, but identities. When the recovery team found the submersible 2 days later, the interior was covered in equations, proving that time and consciousness were the same thing, that memory was just another form of flesh, that identity was a myth created by minds that couldn't accept their own digestibility. The logbook contained thousands of entries, all in Leo Brown's handwriting, spanning decades in both directions. The last entry wasn't written in the logbook. It was carved into the submersible's hull from the inside. Time is digestible. Identity is digestible. Memory is digestible. Only the gray substance remains, and it remembers everything except itself. They never found Leo Brown's body. But sometimes, in ports across the Bay of Bengal, harbor masters report a man asking strange questions about submersible capabilities and depths. He carries papers covered in complex equations and coordinates. He seems to know things he couldn't possibly know about ships that disappeared decades ago, and his eyes, witnesses say, have a peculiar gray tint to them, as if something ancient is looking out through them, searching for something it lost so long ago it can't remember what it was. The Foundation has designated these sightings as SCP-3000-1 through SCP-3000-47. Each instance believes it is the first and only Leo Brown. Each one is drawn to the depths, and in those depths, SCP-3000 continues its endless consumption, not of flesh but of the very thing that makes us who we are, rendering consciousness itself down into a gray paste that thinks and remembers and waits. There you have it, terrifying encounters with SCP-1128 and SCP-3000. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more SCP tales.